we will follow someone in his life path, in its way. His name is John. So relax, sit quietly, and we'll embark on this adventure. This afternoon, John had decided to walk around this big city he knew since he was born. This very evening was to be an important moment in his life. He was to celebrate his 49th birthday anniversary with his family and his friends. He had invited many friends to share this moment of festivity where he was sure everyone would felicitate him, would praise his personal success, either family or business success. He was reaching a state of fullness in his life where everything had been a success. He was born in a rich family. He had a joyful youth. He got excellent education. He almost succeeded everywhere, obtaining a diploma of one of the highest ranking business schools. One must say that since early on, the rule of the family was to perform, and he performed. Completely integrated in this type of society, he adapted himself to any obligation which could allow him to get recognition and rewards. There has been some period of time, when he was around 14 years old, when many questions raised in his mind, questions which remain unanswered by his entourage. Typical question like, who am I really? Is the world finite or infinite? What am I doing here? Why am I here? He was very uneasy with this question, a profound uneasiness that his parents hurried to evacuate using a lot of stereotyped answers based on the Judeo-Christian tradition which was theirs. Then he entered into the active life, a very speedy one, where the only objective was to be the best in order to get recognition and to benefit from a maximum of privilege. Years passed on, he built a family with children. He was often away from home, traveling in the world for his business activity, meeting people similar to him who would assure him his life was a model of success. Until this afternoon, his birthday anniversary. The day before, his wife announced him she decided to rebuild her life with someone else, someone who finally would listen to her, who would understand her. And his children seemed to approve her decision. They also looked like if they were waiting for another family, a life in which they would be recognized, listened, and loved for what they are and not to mimic the success model incarnated by their father. This afternoon, strolling in the streets, he realized fully that almost 30 years had elapsed without him being conscious of his attention being completely canalized on his personal success and all the necessary means to reach it. And the question which came during his teenage years popped up again. How did I ended up here? Who am I really? What is the meaning of all that? He was first tempted to enter into a bar to try to forget all his problems. But he was intelligent enough to understand it would not resolve his problem at all. He then entered in the large library of the town, trying to find answers to his question inside the great tradition of the world. His psy had often talked to him about his me, his ego, his I, and he wanted to understand better what was behind this world. The first row of this library was named Hinduism, and he took a large book which was describing the constitution of man according to the tradition of ancient India. To understand what is this me in this tradition requires the knowledge of the cosmogenesis process, which is the process of the creation of the universe and its components, and also the anthropogenesis process, which is the creation and evolution of man. In the chain of universal experience of manifestation of spirit in matter, many steps are identified in the Genesis. And we start from the first phase according to what is called the Samkhya philosophy, which is one of the 6 schools of India, where from what we call the oneness, Parabrahman, we have the apparition of the spirit, what we call the Purusha, the self, the conscious spiritual entity, and the unconscious material, which is Prakriti, the energy of the Brahman. And we just remember that Prakriti, from which everything will be then emanating, is but a sum of what is called 3 quality in this tradition, which are in equilibrium before manifestation. And it's interesting to note that the current scientific model of the Big Bang is quite similar because it's talk about the breaking of symmetry. So from Prakriti, everything then is emanating. And we will remember 3 main principles. The one is called Buddhi, Ma'at, which is the equivalent of intelligence or rather intuition in our language. Then we have this second emanation, which is called Ahamkara, which is the equivalent of the ego, the I maker. And we will remember the Manas, which is the principle, the thinking principle, and we'll go later on with the other one. Here we are, John thought. There is an ego here. But at the same time, he realized that it would take a lot of time for him to understand the full process of manifestation as it is described in this text. In the ancient Indian tradition, this ahamkara corresponds to the idea of the I, the me, always linked to qualifier, as I am this and that, I am this body, I am these thoughts, I am this emotion, here and now, and so on. Which means that this structure is built from the aggregate of the lived experience since we were born, together with their concrete, for us, result. The first principle of action of this process, the ego, is to select among the elements which are surrounding us, yes, the one which will become mine, to me. And they will become the building block of this structure, the self, the limited ego. It may be useful to note that Ahamkara is functioning with almost the same mode that Buddhi, with the huge difference that where Buddhi is simply the experience of everything which is, Ahamkara is the experience of I am everything which is, and everything is mine. And finally, as we say, Manas is the tool which starts from the sense organ and which manufacture images coming from perception in order to pass them to Ahamkara, which will then compare it to the image stored in his memory in order to identify itself with the image, bring a value judgment to the perception, and finally trigger action and behavior. And just to complete the picture of the constitution of man, we find the 5 organs of perception, the 5 organs of action, what we call the subtle element which will give birth to the gross element that we know. Okay, John thought, I have learned something, but I don't see how this can help me in my current situation. And I don't have the time to review all the traditions from Hinduism. Let's see the next row. The next row is called Buddhism. It has a completely different approach. It starts from what is called the 4 Noble Truths. And the first one is suffering. It is we remember that the Buddha at this time, before its illumination, was just but a man like us. And he realized throughout his own human experience that suffering was everywhere. Wherever you could look, there was suffering. He also realized through his illumination that he knew what was the origin of suffering. And that's where we go back to the ego. We'll find that later on. And also, he knew also that we could stop the suffering. And to do that, he developed what is called the Eightfold Noble Path. In the Buddhist philosophy, there is no permanent, immutable mind which can be called the self, the soul, or the ego. The Buddha has clearly declared that consciousness depends on matter, sensation, perception, and mental formation, and that it cannot exist independently of this condition. What we call a being, an individual or a me, is a convenience sticker that we put on a combination of the 5 components. More recent Buddhism, called Mahayana Buddhism, the one Madame Blavatsky is referring to in her works, have identified 8 consciousness, of which the 7th one looks very similar to what we call the ego. So we have the 5 sensory consciousness, which are attached to the sense organ. The 6th one is the what they call ideation consciousness, which is the mental activity, the intellect activity. Then we have that ego consciousness, and then the seed consciousness, which is the consciousness from which everything emanates. In theosophy, we also use this concept, it's called the alaya consciousness. And in the diagram of meditation of Madame Blavatsky, that is the final step. So this 7 consciousness, named the immediate consciousness, is playing the role of an ego grasping what the first 6 consciousness can capture from the contact with reality. And I think that's where it's important to realize that we are part of reality, and we can experience it mainly through that, through the sensory consciousness plus the ideation. But this ego consciousness remains a transient phenomenon and not an absolute entity. After reading this thought-provoking book, John felt a violent dizzy spell. He sat down on a small stool nearby, trying to regain consciousness. His force and his reason for living resides mainly into this personality, this I, that he had so carefully elaborated, fed, consolidated, and loved beyond any other thing. And then all around him, he sees only other eyes. So, if all that was but a true nightmare, as the Buddhists say, and that the me-I was but only an illusion, where would be the meaning of human life on earth? That was too much perturbating, and he left the Buddhist road to head to the next one. Arriving in front of Christianity, John almost did not enter into it. He thinks he already knew the doctrine, having learned and practiced it since its early youth. He had quit from it rapidly, even if he kept attending Mass. The doctrine was quite more simple. A body, a soul, encompassing mind, emotion, will, and a spirit, the pervasive presence of sins and guilt, the redemption of misdeeds, the free will of man, the last judgment, hell or heaven. Also, he had a hard time to be convinced by the visible reality of the practice of the Christian value in the society of man. By curiosity, he opened a small book of a completely unknown author for him, named The Spiritual Instruction of someone named Master Eckhart. He's one of the mystics, German mystics from the 13th century. He opened it and read, "In truth, except if you first flee from you, everywhere where you will flee, you will find roadblocks and worries wherever you go. People who search for peace inside external things, place or mode, or people, or work, or distant country, or poverty, or lowering, as great or as far it can be, all this is but nothing, and it will not give peace to him. They search wrongly, those who search like that. The more they move away, the less they find what they are looking for. They go like someone who lost its way. The more they go, the more they went astray. So what should one be doing? And that's still Meister Eckhart who is talking. He must first abandon himself. And therefore he will abandon everything. John stay one moment, silent without moving, meditating on this word which seems to awake something deeply inside his chest at the heart level. Then he straightened himself quickly, to abandon myself. But what will remain of me? And of everything I collect and accumulate? I cannot think about dissociating myself from. A brief moment, the idea of death crossed his mind. Yes, he knew that he would have to abandon everything at this moment, but he would see later on. He then continued his quest inside this maze of knowledge. Arriving at one shelf named Occultism, Esotericism, he saw a bunch of dusty books which catch his attention. He never heard about that stream of thought whose name was Theosophia. He decided to sit down and to go through some of this book. He starts with a book talking about the constitution of man and his body. And he felt more relaxed then because this teaching seems to him more familiar than the other one. So we also start with the physical body, which is the instrument with which the incarnated individual can enter into contact with the object and phenomenon of this plan and interact with him. This instrument, the physical body, was built and developed during the long process of evolution by various working agents of the divine. John was so used to identify himself with his body that he found very strange now to look at it as a vehicle in which he was sitting on the driver's seat. Moving on his reading, he learned that the body is tied up with another envelope, which is called ici, here, linga sharira or astral body, which is made of much more subtle material. It is the envelope of energy. And its function is to channel the subtle energy surrounding us to feed the physical body with the various forms of energy which are necessary for its sustainability. We always think that we survive in our physical body as long as we breathe, we eat, and we drink. But the reality of the thing is that what makes the physical body to sustain itself is the subtle energy which is coming from the breath, from what we eat, and from we drink. So there are inside this new world, one can discover a brand new mode of operation based on what we call the subtle channel, a main one and two secondary one, in which the subtle energy is circulating and going through what is called the subtle center, the chakras. This energy is distributing itself and differentiating itself to be able to support all the function of the human body. And we even have identified some special organs from the brain as with occult function, like the pituitary body, which is the organ of transmission toward the higher plane of being, or the pineal gland, which is the vehicle of thought transmission. But it was not what John was looking for. So he continues reading. The next book talks about the emotion body, Kama Manas, which is this layer of energy. Its primary function is to convert the physical vibration received from the five sense organs. Let's take an example. We hear something, we see something, we smell, we touch anything. That is transmitted to our brain, which is capable to recognize a stimuli by looking at its memory and say, yes, I know. And from that there is almost an immediate reaction, which is a judgment value, a value judgment there, and then the reaction I love or I hate. And if we want to illustrate it concretely, we start from a stimuli, an outside stimuli, which is the vibration of the air in any situation. It is sensed by the external ear, and then the internal ear is capable to transform this vibration of pressure into an electrical signal, a very complex signal. The inner ear has something like 25,000 sensors capable to identify any frequency inside a specific range. This electrical signal then is passed on to the subtle body, which then goes to what we call the sensation, the emotion body. It became a sensation. It hurts, and almost instantaneously there is an emotion and a reaction. And that's the process we are going through every situation, every time of the day, or mainly the day. And usually we react, at least we become aware at this stage of the game. Everything has been automatic up to now. Here is the mechanism I well recognize, John thought. It is at the heart of all my action. And this could be an axe for action, but then I need to understand the whole process. The paragraph he was reading was talking about a purification, a self-transformation. And the way to do it was to disengage ourselves consciously from the manifestation which surface in the emotion body, which means not to go to this phase of emotion and reaction. When a desire pops up in ourselves, we may want to understand that it is but a vibration inside the emotional matter, and stop before we identify ourselves with it. And to do that, it requires our full attention, our capability to analyze the phenomenon, and a mastery of ourselves to slow down. To slow down the automated mechanism of perception, sensation, emotion, value, judgment, and reaction. Because that is our basic behavior. And if you want to be able to capture this phase, we really need to slow down everything we do. Thich Nhat Hanh, who was a Zen Buddhist master, used to recommend and to practice in his center what he called the walking meditation. And his recommendation is clearly let go of your sorrow, let go of your worries. That is the secret of walking meditation. At this stage, we've seen the sense organ, the sensation. We have touched base with the next body, which is very close to the emotion body, what Theosophy called the mental body. That's another representation. We can find back the physical body, the energetical body with the energy, the emotion body, and now we are talking about the mental activity. Modern psychology calls it the intellect without having a full understanding of its functioning mode. Theosophia teaches us that this vehicle, what we call this body, this envelope made of very subtle matter, is itself a compound of two components, named the lower and the upper body. I have to go back a little bit. Here we go. So the mental activity has two layers, the lower and the upper. The first one, the lower mental body, is the place where concrete thoughts are operating. Where the next one, the upper mental, is the domain of abstract thoughts. And more important is the understanding that the lower mental belong to what we call the transitory personality, which is built from scratch at each new incarnation, where the upper mental body is the lower vehicle of the individuality, you can see, which evolve life after life. John had a short stop in his breathing. He was slightly familiar with the idea of reincarnation, but it remained for him like a child's story before going to sleep. However, he thought it was a nice idea compared to the Last Judgment. He smiled and went back to his reading. The lower mental body starts from the vibration inside the emotion body, transforming them into mental images, which means it is capable to produce mental image from the sensation, then to combine them together. Everything which comes through our eyes, our ears, our nose, our mouth, our touch sense, the mental is building a compound image that it will compare to its database of image stored inside his memory. So when John sees his wife, in reality, his sense organs have captured a visual image, a body smell, the sound of her voice, etc. And his lower mental recognizes the combination of all these input data as similar to the image of his wife he has inside his memory. He realized that he was not looking anymore at her, but to a static stored image which populates his memory. He was not anymore in touch with the reality of his surrounding, and that's usually what we are living through most of the time. Instead, we are inside the reality. We have very good sensor capable to be in touch with reality, but we have that filtering which makes that as soon as something enters our consciousness, we just almost close the door and we stay with the image we have of reality. This mental body is a very powerful tool, capable of learning all along this life on this earth. But because it stays confined into the domain of thoughts, names and form, its knowledge must be limited. An important conclusion came from this observation. The sensory image of the object we perceive through our sense organ, emotional body, and mental activity exists only in our mental, and therefore is not really the observed object, which is, by the way, changing permanently. All the characteristics that we think belong to the object are mainly our mental construction. And we live in this world like a movie character in the Hollywood studios, which continuously moved through completely imaginary stage sets. The only difference is that each of us has his own studio and unique stage sets. So you can imagine that the difficulty when two studios try to communicate together without opening their doors. And our life in society is the image of that. John thought it must be a good axis for thought. How can that help him understand what he was going through and mainly how to react? He realized he had lost the track of his subject of inquiry. The ego, where does the ego hide itself in the theosophical teaching? In the teaching, the ego, that we call personality, is residing in the lower mental body, and it is in touch with the upper mental body, right there. The lower mental body, as we've seen, is connected with the emotion body and is the image manufacturer. The upper mental body is connected with the upper plan, what we call the plan of the body, the receptacle of the incarnated divine flame. The kama manas, the emotion body, the combination of the lower mental and the emotion body being the brain of the sense organ, including the mental activity, believes he is the caliph in place of the caliph. What we call the personal ego, the human ego, the personality, that's what it is. And there is no immortality for the personal ego outside of its fusion, of the fusion of its nature with the divine ego, in between personality and individuality. Only the most spiritual emanation of the personal human soul are surviving. One can understand why most of the great religions are proposing rules of conduct based on morals and ethics, which are in favor of humility, self-abandonment, service to others. We still need to understand why it does not work or works so very little. John started to be a little saturated by all this theory which gave him so many models of the constitution of man, and maybe you also tonight, sometimes similar, sometimes completely disparate. He saw a conference room where a lecture was starting. The theme of the conference was the ego, its creation and its development in the tradition of the Tibetan Buddhism. He sat down in this room. The lecturer, apparently a Tibetan monk, just started his lecturing. He said that in the Tibetan Buddhism we use an interesting metaphor to describe the operation of the ego. It is the image of the three lords of materialism. The lord of the form, the lord of the speech, and the lord of the spirit. The lord of the form is just the neurotic quest for comfort, security, and pleasure. Our current society is its reflection. Not a single day without a new invention aiming at bringing a whole lot of new gadgets on the market to better entertain, to better please ourselves. Our society based on always more for me know very well how to create the need for some useless gadget which will sell very well. Everything is put in motion to provide the ego the means to please himself, avoiding any inconvenience. The Lord of the speech, the second Lord, is the usage of the intellect to organize the relationship with our world. He spent his time building thought streams which are framing all types of society form, religious, philosophical, political, scientific system, each of them with their own set of rules of interpretation and action. And they have at least a common denominator, again, to provide the ego with an intellect groundwork, with thoughts model which put him at the center and in charge of everything which happened. Krishnamurti told us that man has built in himself image as a sense of security, religious, political, personal, and that is manifest as symbol, idea, and belief. And the burden of these images dominates man's thinking, his relationship, and his daily life. And as a conclusion, he said these images are the cause of our problem because they divide man from man. Anything with the ism is the result of the construction of the Lord of the speech. The ego can only work inside what he knows. He hated the unknown or anything which could look like a threat to its existence. He will use all these concepts as filter in order to catalog, to put a name on any new event. And if he cannot do that, then he goes on panic mode. There must not be a single free space in which the doubt or incertitude could settle. The ego is able to bring anything back to him for its own purpose, including spirituality. What the ego is doing is to mimic the practice and the way of life, including the spiritual ones, where this practice are aimed at the complete cessation, the abandoning of the ego. It is a mechanism of self-protection for him, because to abandon the ego is the last thing that he can wish and that he can do. Each situation of life is an example of the activity of one or more lord of materialism. So, first important findings. The ego to exist need an environment which provides him with a lot of stimulus to feed his desire and to which he will systematically identify himself. He needs thought schemes which answer all the questions. And finally, he identifies himself with all the situations to justify his existence. The Buddha investigated the process used by the three lords. He discovered that the three lords seduce us using a fundamental myth, the solidity of our being. But in reality, it is a false myth. In reality, nothing permanent exists as an ego. The succession of movement makes us to believe in the existence of a solid entity. It's like looking at a movie made of successive images, make us think of a continuous image. And we can make a quick comparison with something else. We are convinced, since we are born, that matter exists, that our body is matter is solid. And the way we measure matter, scientifically speaking, is by measuring its mass. If we now, using the latest discovery of modern science, if we go down inside matter, starting from, let's say, the body with all its system, then its organ, then its cellule, then its molecule, going down, we reach the basic level, which is what we call the basic building block of the physical material, which are called quark today, inside the nucleus of every atom. And we say, Eureka, I found where is the mass. It is in the quark, because there is nothing else visible. But when we try to measure the mass of the quarks, they represent less than 3% of the mass of the particle. So where is the mass? That's quite, for the scientific, it's a problem. Where is the mass? The mass in reality, and they could find it where it is, in the quantum field theory, it is inside the kinetic energy of the particle, plus something around the glue, which glue the particle. So the conclusion of that, and that's quite interesting when we try to draw bridges between modern science and tradition, is the fact that where we think we are in a very solid body, or anything around us, it's a sea of moving energy. It's a sea of moving energy. There is nothing concrete as we used to think. It's just matter is a sea of energy. And the next question is, what is making this energy to move? But we will not detail it tonight, because it is during the process of what we call cosmogenesis, the creation of the universe and its element, the divine. The breath of the divine is what makes this energy to move. To demonstrate that the Buddha carefully observed the process and identified all the defense line of the ego. All the defense line of the three lords in order to be able to break them. And this is the method he proposed to transform the ego. So how to transform the ego? First, to stop fighting. The ego will always win. The fight of ego with himself is consuming a great deal of energy and does not allow for an opening of the necessary space to let the vision of reality to emerge as it is, naturally. For this affirmation to become a certitude, one will have to develop the practice to slow down the activity and a close look at the protection mechanism of the ego. The vision of reality cannot happen in the middle of tumult and permanent fight. The practice to really observe the phenomenon, to reach the correct understanding, is meditation. This meditation, this type of meditation, is what we call the let be, or the be-ness meditation. It is not a trance, it is not a mental gymnastic. It is a state of being where the natural energy of the spirit can flow freely without being hampered, either by the automatic grasping of the mental activity or the wild wandering of thoughts. We've seen the mechanism of conceptualization of any external or internal stimuli. That can be the starting point of the practice. Discursive thoughts are permanently sweeping our mental horizon. It is the first barrier which prevents us to see further. By observing them quietly, one can see them to appear, to move, to dance in the mental river. One can also see how the ego identifies itself with them. As soon as a thought recalls a souvenir or triggers any desire, the ego adorns himself with the garment of the actor to create a scenario where he will be the main actor. The perception of reality has completely ceased to be. We have moved again into an imaginary world created by the Lord of Speech for his own need to exist. When we regain consciousness, we can go back to determine at what moment in the process the awareness disappears. The secret of meditation is not to try to agitate or to suppress the mental formation. Let them to appear and recognize them for what they are. It requires this discrimination and a good reserve of energy. And this energy can be made available if we do not waste it in never-ending fight that we try to lead in order to feel better. We need to be convinced of the uselessness of our fights before we can switch to this new mode of being. If we can calm down the flow of thoughts, then another domain is opening up for investigation, the emotion one. And here also, the practice will consist in avoiding to encourage or to repress them. We observe and identify them. To see them clearly, to understand their energetic source vibrating in the vital substratum of the world, will help not to be anymore their puppet. And of course it will not happen immediately, especially if the emotions are used to express themselves freely. The law of inertia in physics is applicable here. So to calm down the flow of emotion, one should not repress them, but observe them and try not to identify with them. The mental or the intellect never succeed in putting them under control. It just cannot do it. The moral system from the many traditions are there mainly to allow life in community. And history tells us, even today, that to refrain emotion is usually generating profound troubles. Being conscious that emotions are an integral part of our being, that they are a reservoir of energy, and that they can be transformed or reoriented toward the development is an important step on the self-transformation path. Examining his thoughts, his emotion, his mental concept, the Buddha discovered one not need to fight to be free. The true spiritual path of Buddhism starts from the analysis of the material and mechanism of the mind, which is first the playground of the ego. And that is also what Madame Blavatsky, the founder of the Theosophical Society, told us in her book, The Voice of the Silence. Having become indifferent to object of perception, the pupil must seek out the Raja of the sense, the thought producer, he who awake illusion. And his famous phrase is, the mind is the great slayer of the real, lets the disciple slay the slayer. The conference was ending, and John was trying to gather his ideas. These ideas which were whirling around, stunning him. The idea that the ego is so cherished could be an usurper who looks like the master of the game was very perturbing for him. And at the same time, he felt confusedly that this approach may help him for a better understanding of his life. By any means, he wanted to learn more about it. The library was to close, and he grabbed some books on the shelf, contemporary thinker and philosopher, and walked to his club to sit comfortably and continue his quest. He had chosen one of the many works of an Indian contemporary thinker that he had tried to read long time ago, but which had left him with a profound discomfort impression. His discourse was so radical, calling for the abandonment of all stereotype, all ideology, all belief, that at this time he came out of it confused and skeptical. He opened one of the books and read, "The immeasurable cannot be looked for by thought, because thought is always measured. The sublime is not included in the structure of thought and reasoning. It is not the product of emotion and feeling." It looks like a repetition of what we heard. Interesting enough, he said, if you are looking for the supreme, you will not find it. And it can come for you if you are lucky, and the luck comes from the window of your heart, not from your thoughts. From these two extracts, we can just concentrate a little bit on the first one. If we go deeper inside that, if you are looking for the supreme, you will not find it. One can rapidly determine that the one who is willing to find the supreme is always the same, the ego, who want to control its environment and who do not have the capability to enter into conscious contact with the divine. The Voice of the Silence, one of the books of Madame Blavatsky, told us that the self of matter and the self of spirit can never meet. One of the twain must disappear. There is no place for both. And that is exactly what another mystic, Christian mystic from the 16th century in Spain, Saint John of the Cross, is telling us when he is describing its own experience to go to the divine union. He described what he called the night of the sensation, then the night of the intellect, which is in order to be able to approach the divine, you even need to get rid of everything you think you know. And finally, the last phrase, the luck comes from the window of your heart. This is also the approach extolled by all Greek religion and theosophy, opening ourselves to others, be at the service to others. The Buddhists call it the unconditioned love, the double bodhicitta. John closed his books. He started to have a glimpse on approaches and means for anyone to work on this fundamental and universal question. He understood the task was immense and difficult, that it would require enormous sacrifice, the main one being the demystification of the veiled mechanism of the ego. He was not familiar with the process of meditation, but he was eager to discover it. Now he was appeased and serene. Still with some apprehension, he knew he could go back home tonight and face the family situation with a willingness to engage in a profound self-transformation. And, whatever the result, with a resoluteness to concentrate his energy on the quest of his spiritual path that he had for so long neglected. As a conclusion, if there is an important subject in a spiritual quest, it is really this one, to understand what we are made of and how we operate. It is mandatory. It is a prerequisite and it can fill our whole life. But as long as we have not integrated that holistic vision of the human life inside its environment, we have the risk of a never-ending wandering in our quest. We know many examples where people invest all their energies in practice aiming at reaching the divine, but who end up only in building this immense mental fortress which imprison them. The understanding of the ego operating mode is the key which, opening the heart, can let the ever-present divine to shine. We need not to underestimate the task. It is a warrior job which requires a lot of energy and determination. The ego is very smart, astute, like a chameleon which can transform itself in any possible shape or color for us not to recognize it. Meditation is the powerful tool to observe our behavior in a calm and quiet environment. But because we cannot spend our life in meditation, every moment of every day can bring us an experimental ground where we can observe the ego behavior. Our lives are full of perception, sensation, feeling, thoughts, memory, concept, value, judgment, action, reaction. Let's use them to unravel the Grand Vizier who pretend to be Caliph in place of the Caliph. And let's remember, we don't want to, and we cannot destroy the ego. Its role as Grand Vizier remains important. We just want to transform him, that he would let the divine light to illuminate our lives. It is that light which can transform the substance of the being and reduce the suffering inside and outside ourselves. So you may want to remember that image which summarizes everything which we said tonight. Sometimes it is hard to open your hand, but you need to. There is no other way if you want to reach the help which can come from the upper plane if you keep to stay attached to the ego. And we are recommending a balanced cooperation between the heart and the mind. Thank you very much for your attention.
Well, thank you very much. That was quite a lot of very interesting and practical wisdom in the ego. Thank you. Does anyone have any questions?
Thank you for your talk. Just the last few images sort of raised a question for me. Is the ego to be got rid of or to be transfigured?
To be transformed. We cannot get rid of it. No. He is useful. We just, he is the captain on the boat. Okay.
So the image there, should he let go of his ego?
Yeah.
Or should he transform and transfigure it?
In fact, you're right. It should transform it. Not. No. He cannot. Maybe it's misleading. I agree with you. But thank you for the question. Yeah. Yes, it must be transformed for the captain to head to the right direction.
Because this, if I can just carry on a bit, many of the things you said sounded deeply subversive in that in Western culture, the best in Western culture is to affirm the self, the person, the individual person, and you was, in certain ways you were recommending that we deconstruct the person, and that, in a sense, is to get rid of it. Like, for instance, if you associate the person with matter, then the person we know, the ordinary self that we all love in other people, that's deleted when the matter body stops functioning. And this is really equivalent to the ancient statement, which I regard as a horrible statement, dust you are and to dust you shall return.
Yeah.
I mean, isn't that the same thing that you're saying?
No.
Now, I know you're saying more than that, but
No, but much
worries
more than
me.
that. Much more than that. In the process of death, as we know from the tradition, the physical body is disintegrating and going back to its source. That's from there that some texts say dust and dust, okay? But as we've seen, there are much more bodies on which we are, which constitute ourselves, and the energetical body is also not destroyed. Nothing is destroyed. The form is teared apart, and then our energy is going back to the universal energy. The mental aspect is also going back to what we call the mental plan. Okay? And the thing in the teachings is that the experience, the essence of the experience of the human being on earth is what is transmigrating from one life to the other one. To keep, like we're in school, every degree we use what we've been remembering and learning on the previous degree. So that's what the teaching is explaining. But it's a very good point. The ego is something essential in the way we operate on earth, in our incarnation. So we don't want to destroy it, but we want it to stop being that fortress which does not allow us to stay in contact with reality. We try to remove the filtering of the ego. But behind the ego, again, there is a captain who is there to manage everything he perceived. If we can redirect it toward the divine light, that is what we need to do. And the divine light is in the heart. Because that's something which we learn from all tradition. There is a divine spark. And the divine maybe is something we put too much an image on the word, but there is a flame inside each of us which is driving us, even if we are not conscious of it. And the idea is for the ego is to open up for this flame to be able to guide us. For those who know Sri Aurobindo, one of the thinker of the India, modern India, in his Science of the Yoga, he explained that how we should, what we can do and we should do is just clean up our emotion, our mental and so on, and open up for this flame to be able to take on and do the job of bringing us later on.
Wonderful. Well, again, thank you very much. And I believe if you'd all like to, we've got tea and cookies. We can have a chat and maybe ask some more questions. Yeah.
Could we talk about science, or is it?
Oh, of
not
course. Yeah,
appropriate?
yeah. You want 5 minutes or so and talk about science? Yeah, that sounds
That's okay.
brilliant. Yeah, we'll keep it rolling. Yeah.
It's no more than 5 minutes. It's just to explain where we stand in terms of building bridges between tradition, theosophy, and science. We know that human society driving factor are the main one: religion, tradition, philosophy on one side, science, and economics and politics, roughly speaking. We know that science today is the intellectual understanding of the physical world, from the largest structure down to the tiniest one, in order to find the physical building block of our world. We also know that science has been going through all the kingdom, from the mineral to the vegetal to the animal to the man, classifying, identifying the rule, the process, and so on. So it's very precious on that respect. Yeah. Today there are 7 million scientists doing research in the world. They are working on something like 250 plus academic disciplines everywhere. 1 million papers are published per year, and they have a budget which is almost 2% of the GDP of the world. What we think is that, as we say in our teaching, there is only one thing called reality or oneness. And we look at it with different eyes. We look at it through the scientific eyes, or we look at it through the revelation, the text, all the tradition, which explain the difference. But because there is only one reality, there must be a way to connect the two, to explain some of the unexplained in scientific with the tradition, and maybe invert. And we remember that the science today is basically the explanation of the physical world, together with the paradigm of materialism, where the tradition is much more holistic, encompassing the complete dimension of the universe and man. So to do that, we have launched a project which is called theoscience.org, which is dedicated to that finding in the research, in the publication, anything which can build a bridge with what we know from the tradition. So it was just to inform the community that there is a web science which is publishing on real-time discovery, which are relevant to theosophy or tradition at large. And we have a quarterly e-publication to communicate on significant discovery. You can access freely to that, and any contribution is welcome. 5 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you.
Now I think just not to conclude, because we never conclude such type of lecture. Everything has been said, everything has been written, everything has been spoken to. We have access to an enormous amount of documentation today, either from the tradition side or from the scientific side or whatsoever. We have everything. Now we need to move on. We need to be curious, to go and look